This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 121 of Here's How for the 3rd of April 2021. Direct democracy is proposed as a way to make decisions independently of politicians. But what would it actually look like? Let's hear from an advocate.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up on today's podcast, you vote to go to war with a country. You can't unvote that the next day or the next week or the next year.
I also can't undo what I had for breakfast this morning. Why is it necessarily a good thing to undo things? Why would that be better than, the reality we live in is that time moves forward and we can't undo things. Politically, you can undo things somewhat more. You can change your mind. And
that's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who does that. For the people who don't, Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. We have an expectation of a rules-based system of international order. Some of these rules are very famous. They show up in popular media, things like diplomatic immunity. Basically, if you send an ambassador to another country, they can't be arrested, their bags can't be searched, you can't even give them a parking ticket. That gives us some anomalies sometimes, again, more often in fiction than in real life, but it does happen. The wife of an American government worker in England drove on the wrong side of the road, killed a young man a while back, and she was whisked back to the US to escape justice. It's not clear that she did have immunity. It's not even clear what her husband's position was, probably because he was a spy. But countries almost always follow these rules because they want to benefit from them sometimes too. Diplomatic immunity is one, but there are lots more. Some of them are explicitly codified. Some of them are just understood conventions. At a high level, these are rules against one country trying to prosecute rulers of another, and it goes all the way down to how leaders are treated when they visit another country, who gets a red carpet, who gets the national anthem played, and all that. There's one important thing to remember here. Rules benefit the weak. That's not always true. There will be 1,000 examples where someone can point out where weak countries suffer because of capricious rules, but that doesn't change the basic principle. Without rules, the strong can do and take what they want. Rules, even if they're imperfect, even if they're not consistently applied, generally benefit the weak. We've had 2 instances in recent weeks of people, for totally understandable reasons, demanding that Ireland throw out that international rulebook of how countries behave towards each other. The first were the demands to expel the Israeli ambassador to mark disapproval for the ferocious attack on the densely packed, poorly defended and impoverished refugee settlements in the Gaza Strip. The second was the calls for various retributions against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus, which, in an act of what can only be called air piracy, forced a Ryanair jet to land in order to seize the exiled opposition activists Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapega. I'd add a third Irish-related incident to the outrage list, the cyber attack on the HSE IT systems that have crippled the healthcare system in Ireland. I don't think that this was done on the orders of a foreign government, but the highly sophisticated teams of hackers operate with, at a minimum, a nod and a wink of approval from the Kremlin. Russian intelligence services, the FSB and the GRU, most certainly know exactly who these people are, know exactly where they are, and know exactly what they're doing. They probably have these guys on speed dial on their office phones. It's highly likely that the bosses of this gang pay up to elements within the intelligence services, probably cash, but also most likely putting their services at the disposal of the Russian military when required, in exchange for operating with immunity. I think that the attack on the HSE was probably purely motivated by cash, but the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, which disrupted supplies of fuel from Texas to much of the southeastern United States, is even more sinister. In theory, this was also a ransomware attack, but I find it very difficult not to see this as a trial run for a military operation to cripple the enemy's infrastructure. It goes without saying that these cyber attacks and the Kremlin's, at best, blind eye towards the criminals responsible for them, along with the Israeli attacks on civilians in Gaza and the air piracy in Belarus, are massive breaches of the international rules for how international relations should be run. There's a huge temptation to say we should do the same in reprisal, hit back, hack their systems, seize their aircraft, expel their ambassador. I'm not arguing that we should not defend ourselves. We should. But it's important to note that there seems to be a decline in the respect being shown to these rules around the world. Russia sending agents to murder defectors in England and Germany. Thai police cooperating with Saudi thugs trying to force the escaping daughter of some bigwig onto a plane back to captivity, along with the other issues I've mentioned. The West is not innocent either, with support for coups in Venezuela and Bolivia. They might argue that it's against a dictatorial government in Venezuela. They might be right, but there are rules against this, and they exist for a reason. On the HSE cyber attack, the government was absolutely right not to pay those crooks a cent. And I have no evidence for this, but I suspect the fact that the gang published an unlock code to decrypt the data on their website could have been the result of behind-the-scenes pressure from Ireland on their counterparts in Russia, to the extent you could even call it pressure. So my point is this: these rules are not perfect, and they are not perfectly observed, far from it. But to the extent that they exist, they are to our benefit, mostly. If any country feels like trampling all over Ireland's sovereignty, there is precious little that we can do about it. In terms of international relations, Ireland isn't a small fry. We're not even a minnow. What little power we have to defend our interests comes from appealing to the sense of fair play within the rules of the international community. If we lose that, we have nothing. It is in Ireland's interests to promote the primacy of these rules at every turn, and even that doesn't get us far. The world is an unstable place. We may be entering an even more unstable phase, and even sticking to the rules is no guarantee that others will respect them for us. But that's all we have, that and hope.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line, I have Dr. Roslyn Fuller. She's formerly of Trinity College Dublin and NUI Maynooth, and she's now the Managing Director of the Solonian Democracy Institute, as well as being an author of textbooks on law and a writer for various newspapers, including The Times and The Independent. Roslyn, you advocate what's called direct democracy. For people who haven't heard of that before, exactly what is it briefly?
Yeah, well, the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy is that in a representative democracy, you elect a person and that person represents you and then makes decisions, for example, on passing laws. In a direct democracy, you vote on those issues directly. So every time we have a referendum, we're practicing direct democracy. And every time we have an election, we're practicing representative democracy.
Okay, and do I understand you correctly to want to expand direct democracy, maybe have referendums more often, or to almost get rid of representative democracy altogether, have no Dáil, and just have the whole population vote on every single issue?
Yeah, well, what I do is it's based on work I did while I was writing my PhD, but it basically is about, as you say, increasing the amount of decisions people are directly involved in. That could be having more referendums. That could be something like participatory budgeting, where people make decisions directly on the budget. And that could be something that gradually leads to something where representatives become less and less important. So that is kind of like the final level would be something like what they originally practiced under the name of democracy in Athens, which would be exactly what you're describing, where there really are very few representatives compared to today, and the vast majority of decisions are made directly. However, it's definitely like a continuum. There's not necessarily an on and off switch. There are nations today like Ireland or Switzerland where people are involved a lot more in direct decision making than, for example, maybe a place like Germany or the United States, where they're not as much.
Oh, okay. Well, pause then on that, because give me your pinnacle. If you could be king of the world in the morning and you had to decide exactly where we would go on this, would you advocate going the full way to having essentially no democratically elected representatives and having citizens making every single decision?
That's kind of funny, because then I wouldn't be the king. But
true, yes.
I think I don't think it's something where you can flip things on and off like a switch, right? It does take, you're talking about mass mobilizing people, but yes, I do think that would be a better end stage. You have to continually move forward on that, on increasing participation, or unfortunately, you tend to move backwards. And that's what we're experiencing now in the world, is kind of a moving backwards on a democracy and a kind of retreat of democracy. People are involved less. Parties have fewer members. They don't consult with their members as much. It tends to be a little bit more of a cabal. The same can be said on the wealth front. Globalization and neoliberalism have led to a lot of decisions being taken through international treaties. So that would be like my original area of expertise, rather than through democratic decision making. So we see a retreat of democracy. And what I advocate for is to push democracy forward. And yes, the end stage, or, the true democracy and the original meaning of democracy in ancient Athens was what you're describing, people being involved in all decisions, but it is a gradual process to get there.
Okay, pause on that, because I want to just quote a little clip from your website, which says, this is talking about you, having foreseen the current assault on democracy long before Brexit and Trump were household names, her relentless defence of people power has seen her articles and interviews published in countless newspapers and democracies. Surely Brexit was an example of direct democracy.
Yeah, exactly. No, but that's it. But since Brexit, we've seen a real push on democracy. So yes, Brexit is an example of direct democracy, but because some people didn't like the decision in Brexit, they started to say, and particularly in academia and in journalism, we got this wave of articles saying that perhaps democracy isn't a good idea, perhaps people are too ignorant, perhaps, democracy ends when there's too much democracy, all of these kinds of things. There was a huge backlash, which I don't know how much it's filtered out to like the general public, but definitely within academic and journalistic circles, it hit a huge peak with all kinds of anti-democratic literature being published.
Sure. And we have an intelligence audience on this podcast, so you can talk about those ideas, absolutely, and you can be sure that people will understand what you're saying when they're listening to this podcast. One issue about that is that in most countries, not in your home country of Canada, I know, and also not in our neighbours in the UK and perhaps in the US, but in almost every other democracy, we have some form of proportional representation so that the parliament is proportionally attributed, more or less, sometimes more precisely, sometimes less so, to the number of votes that any given party gets. Referendums are absolutely winner takes all. How do you manage that?
It doesn't really make any difference, because in the parliament you also vote yes or no on legislation. So it really doesn't matter if you have many different parties.
It does, because you have to put together a coalition that represents at least half of the people, and that gives a coherent program for government. Some people would argue maybe not very coherent, but it has to have enough coherence to get together at least half of the representatives behind that program for government. Depending on the whims or the what's in fashion or what is trending on Twitter today or tomorrow, you might get a different policy being voted on today and tomorrow being completely contradictory?
Okay, that's untrue on two accounts. The first thing is that actually elections are quite flawed in the sense that usually people who get elected don't have a majority of votes in favor. I mean, the single transferable voting system, which we use in Ireland, and I like to some extent, kind of is a system where you actually don't know what people voted for or why they voted for it. So a vote, there's problems mathematically in the sense that there's usually vote distortion. So just because people get elected doesn't mean they enjoyed majority support. And that's even true in first-past-the-post systems, which have the most clear...
Well, it's certainly true in first-past-the-post systems.
Yeah. So but there's wasted votes in every system. There's also wasted votes in proportional systems.
But
and you can even
although in Ireland there are very, very few.
They still exist, though. So
they
it's a
still
matter
exist,
of...
absolutely, yes. But there are very, very few.
Okay, but how many wasted votes are there in a referendum?
Well, 50%, I would imagine, but nevertheless.
No, that's not true. In a referendum, every vote does count. In an election, lots of votes don't count because, for example, the person you are voting for may already be elected, for example. So what parties do is they game these systems. They game the first past the post system is the easiest, but you can pretty much game any system. And what parties seek to do is to increase what's called their vote to seat ratio, or that's what I call it anyway, which means you're good at winning more seats with fewer votes by basically apportioning your resources to where you think you'll win a seat. So if you...
I'm going to pause you, Roslyn, I'm going to pause you on that. And the first thing I'm going to say is, first of all, I try to be very straight, and I'm not like an RT presenter. When I have an opinion, I'll let you know what it is, and I'll let you argue back against it. And I disagree with you on this, although I hope we can disagree politely and get more light than heat into the discussion. But when I'm, for example, going to the doctor, I'm sure that every doctor that I could choose, somebody will be able to point out a patient of theirs that died. And in fact, ultimately, all doctors' patients die. But some doctors are better than others. But it's not a valid measurement to say that you can point out a flaw or where a doctor's patient died or whatever. What's the valid measurement there is whether the treatment that this doctor is giving is better than anything else that's on offer. And if you're getting the best that's on offer, that's the best that's on offer. You can't necessarily ask for perfection. It's true, that's true also of any democratic system. There will be flaws in all systems, and merely pointing out the flaw in one system doesn't necessarily tell us that it is an unacceptable system. What we need to do is we need to get the system that has the fewest flaws. Would you agree?
Sure. I don't see the relevance. I was in the middle of trying to answer the question.
Well, then go ahead. Go ahead on that. Then.
Elections aren't that representative. So there are statistical flaws. No election is completely representative. So what you end up with in the Dáil is actually not necessarily proportionate to how people voted. The second flaw is, of course, when people vote for a party, we don't know why they voted for that party. So some people may have voted for a party for one reason. Other people may have voted for a party for a completely different reason. Still, third people might vote for a party because they've always voted for that party. Or they might, as you say, think it's the least bad choice among those other parties. Then after that, you have coalition building. That might, of course, at the moment, the coalition in Ireland has left out the party that got the most votes in the election. So you end up with these kind of things where you can actually be governed by a minority. And it's actually not unusual, especially in first-past-the-post systems, but it can happen in any system that you are actually governed by a minority of votes. So that is the statistical flaw with electoral systems. They suffer from not being accurate. And because they're not accurate, you can game them by trying to win more seats with fewer votes. And of course, what you can do, of course, as well, is just not do what you say you're going to do once you get elected. So it's really not true to say that representative democracy builds a coalition and referendums don't. Referendums also have to build coalitions among people of varying interests in order to get them to pass that measure. So
let me then present some of the issues that come to my mind, and I'll let you tell me whether you think you can solve them or whether they're genuine issues. And for example, right now, the Conservative government in the UK is using the argument that the Scots have already had, 6 or 7 years ago, a once-in-a-generation referendum. And they're using that to say that Scottish independence cannot proceed. There can be no further referendum on that. How would you overcome the issue of permanence?
Well, you could make rules easily. You could say, we're only going to vote we've made a deal that we're not going to table this issue again for 10 years. I mean, the Athenians often did things like that, where they said, we have a minimum, we have a certain time we're going to stick with this, or we're going to make these more permanent decisions that can't be as easily overturned. You can demand, for example, that there needs to be a supermajority, which is harder to achieve in order to overturn something. So there's various ways you can actually do that. I mean, it's just a matter of making it harder to get a yes. The harder you make it to get a yes, the more difficult it is to overturn something.
And
it takes longer.
Who makes those rules?
Well, why, for example, the people can make them, or most countries have a constitution as well where it's laid down. So you can do that.
You're saying that an election can be gamed and parties can game various systems in the election, which is completely true. But those rules are absolutely open to being gamed, aren't they?
How?
For example, manipulating when and how often a particular issue can be addressed.
Well, if people have decided we do not want to deal with this issue for a certain amount of time, then you're merely fulfilling the thing that you decided. When I say that elections are distorted, it means they're distorted in a way where the will of the people isn't.
Pause then to address that
isn't executed.
Okay, pause to address that in the specific instance that I gave.
Okay.
The Scottish people voted about 7 years ago by about 10 points not to become independent. It looks from opinion polls that decision would be reversed if that vote happened now. So people who don't want independence can just, if they're able to, prevent a vote. Surely if 50% plus one of the population want to have a vote, that they must be allowed to have it.
Okay, well, those aren't the rules that currently obtain in Britain. Britain isn't a direct democracy, it's a representative democracy, and the Houses of Parliament need to give their permission for this. Those are the rules that currently are the legal valid rules in Britain right now. They don't live under a direct democracy. So That's why this dispute has arisen.
Okay. Would you accept that there is a knotty problem there that might require a compromise that not everybody will be happy with?
Yeah, I mean, that's all politics.
Okay.
Not everyone is happy with any decision. That's never going to happen, that you have a situation where everyone is happy with every single decision. But you can have systems where the majority will is implemented more directly with minimal distortions, as opposed to decisions to systems where there are multiple distortions and that are very easy for minorities to grasp control of and to continue having that control for quite a long time.
Okay, then to address that directly, on your website, on the Solonian Democracy Institute website, you list various vendors of software, and I think listeners to this podcast will be relatively tech savvy. It's obvious that technology would have to be used in order to achieve this. We couldn't have the entire population showing up or voting on paper every day. But you list various vendors of software that could be used. Who decides which vendor to use?
Okay, so first of all, probably you wouldn't end up having a situation where people were voting every day. So I think it actually is possible that you can have a direct democracy still on paper. That is possible. And I mean, it may be necessary if, you can't overcome the security obstacles of voting online. But that being said, you're right. I mean, voting online is much cheaper and easier to organize. So so these vendors I don't think they're not really listed on our website. We did a study about them and we kind of investigated what's out there. So some of those are private vendors, some of them are public, kind of semi-public or publicly operated systems. Some of them are open source. So there's a whole variety. Well, I mean, either people could decide what they want to use, or like my preference would actually be for a public system, frankly. But these softwares are very good prototypes and very good ideas of what can be used. I mean, typically what would happen is that people use these softwares already for local exercises. So for local consultations, for example, or local participatory budgeting. And then usually the county council makes a decision about which software they want to use for that.
Just to expand a little bit further on the frequency of voting and so forth. In some cases, there will be decisions that simply cannot, for practical reasons, be revisited. I hate to bring Hitler into it, but there was a referendum in Germany in 1934 to make Hitler a dictator. That was clearly not one that was going to be revisited at any time after that. But in more current times, Colombia had a referendum which failed on making peace with the FARC rebel group in the jungles of the country, and the Brexit referendum in the UK, and you are correct to note that people perhaps had motivated thinking in arguing against that, but by the time Brexit was implemented, the population shift was such that, because of course younger people were more likely to vote pro-EU, older people were more likely to vote Brexit. By the time Brexit was implemented, enough old people had died and young people had come on the voting register that even if there wasn't a change in public opinion, Brexit did not have a majority. There is a permanence problem there, isn't there?
How so? I mean, we live in a reality. We continue to act. We make a decision, and we deal with the consequences of that decision.
Well, you vote to go to send,
Yes.
to go to war with a country. You can't unvote that the next day or the next week or the next year.
I also can't undo what I had for breakfast this morning.
Okay.
Why is it necessarily a good thing to undo things? Why would that be better than, the reality we live in is that time moves forward and we can't undo things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Politically, you can undo things somewhat more. You can change your mind and say, I would like to now change my mind about this to somewhat more than, what I have for breakfast this morning, which is something I can never, ever undo. But okay, yes, you can. So, yes, you can just hold another referendum. I mean, the situation with Hitler is a very different one. Hitler was put in power electorally through an electoral coalition. The referendums, if you can call them that were had in Germany during the rule were extremely violent. If you look at the old voting ballots, you'll see these extremely large things with yes on them. So people weren't really given a choice. It definitely wasn't a free vote at all. I mean, and that can happen in any...
Well, I've studied this, and you're absolutely correct. This was not a free vote, but such was the majority. The people who have studied this believed that Hitler would not have gotten such a large majority if that had been run on a more democratic basis, but it would appear that he would have gotten a majority.
May or may not. I guess we'll never know, since, everyone who, a lot of people who are already pouring out of Germany at that point, or arrested. So it's quite difficult to say he would have gotten a majority. I mean, that's pretty hypothetical. It's very, very hard to tell how referendums go, and also elections most of the time, because, it depends on how things unfold on the ground. And, if you want an example of not being able to put things back and say, how would things have gone? I think it would be all of the preceding years of German political life. We don't know what would happen if people who had left Germany had decided to stay in Germany, for example. We don't know what would have happened had there been less violence. That's quite difficult to go back and say it would have led to this or that vote being different.
The main objection that I see to what you're proposing is essentially attention span, in that, and I mentioned the comparison with a doctor earlier, and politicians, like them or hate them, are expert to a certain degree in public policy, and some of them are actually very, very expert, and some of them, when they are elected, are not particularly expert, but become expert pretty quickly just because of the nature of the job. But I'm thinking of one particular effect, which is in terms of fundraising. In particular, the example that I saw was in regards to leukemia. And children's leukemia wards have a huge amount of essentially money to spend, because it is so easy, because it tugs at people's heartstrings, to raise money for childhood leukemia sufferers. And adult leukemia wards, by contrast, who have, of course, much more patients, are vastly underfunded in terms of charity. What safeguard would you have for digital democracy, direct democracy, against echo chambers, fake news and manipulations, but in particular just the lack of attention span that people have when they're not professional politicians?
Okay, well, there's a lot of things there. The vast majority of politicians are backbenchers, and I know quite a few politicians. I don't know very many of them who are experts at really that much, frankly, at the end of the day. Other than being very, very good at kind of judging public opinion in their area. That I will give them full marks on. But often they don't have a huge background in economics, or anything that's really all that relevant that you would really have to get into. A lot of decisions, a lot of stuff today is actually prepared by civil servants. So, that's something to realize, is that a lot of our policy and a lot of our papers and so forth are prepared by civil servants rather than politicians directly. So if you want something where a lot of expertise resides, it's there. And actually, there's a lady in New York, Beth Simone Novak, who's written a very interesting book about that as well, which is really worth reading. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is, well, I can only say when I did an exercise here in Ireland where I asked people in my constituency to vote on things, online. And probably one of the most popular policies, and I would say this is true from knocking on doors as well, is having a public healthcare system. So the overwhelming majority of people want a public healthcare system. So your question as to why, if charity is funding things, that there would be more money given to this or that, seems to be a faulty way of running a healthcare system, period. And most people don't want to run the healthcare system that way to begin with. So regardless of whether or not of, the factual basis of that claim, it doesn't really matter because you're talking about doing something completely different in the first place and people preferring that method.
Pause on that thought, Roslyn, because I think you're probably right. People would overwhelmingly vote in favour of having a public health care system.
Right. Because
one exists now in many countries and there exists an example to follow. But in 1945, when the NHS was set up, there wasn't an example. There was incredibly trenchant opposition from doctors against the establishment of the NHS, and it's quite plausible that somebody could have come along and made a different, for example, grant-based or insurance-based proposal that would have gained more acceptance from doctors, and they would have been the people most likely to campaign hard on it. They had the most motivation to do that. The fact is that an Aaron Bevan had a vision, was a politician, was elected with a huge majority. People trusted him who did not understand that policy. He brought through a policy, and that policy, in retrospect, is hugely popular, but only in retrospect.
Right. Political decisions are often contentious when they are made.
And very often,
I don't understand what this proves either way. I mean, in a direct democracy, decisions would also continue to be contentious. So, I mean, naturally, again, as we go through time, we decide, that was a very good decision, and we might decide another decision wasn't a great decision. This is the nature of life.
But my core point on that is that somebody with a vision who is trusted might well be a better person, in particular because, I am reminded of, in the aftermath of the Brexit decision, one particular Sky News correspondent told how he approached, off the record, one of the pro-Brexit campaigners and said, "What now?"
I just wanted to bring you this. This comes from a Conservative lead MP who I think will be backing Boris Johnson in the leadership contest. He told me this. I said to him, "So where's the plan? Can we see the Brexit plan now?" There is no plan. The Leave campaign don't have a post-Brexit plan. And he was pointing over there to where the Vote Leave HQ was, and he pointed over there and he said, number 10 should have had a plan. Now, it sounds like I'm making that up. That literally happened 2 hours ago.
With a campaign group in a referendum, after the fact, there's no accountability, is there?
Yeah, there is. The people who voted are accountable, and they have to live with the consequences.
Well, and to use an Irish example,
accountability is when you actually have to live with consequences. It's not a finger pointing exercises. You actually have to live with what you voted for. So you are accountable in the very most true sense of the word.
But the pro-Brexit side made a whole slew of promises, which turned out to be a pack of lies.
Really? I'm really surprised to hear that. They're investing in exactly what they said they were going to. And
for example, Daniel Hannan, one of the most ardent pro-Brexiteers at the time of the referendum, said very, very clearly, nobody is talking about leaving the single market. Nobody is talking about having any trade barriers between the UK and the EU.
First of all, absolutely nobody is suggesting that we would give up our position in the free market in Europe. No one in Brussels, and no one except some tendentious British pro-Europeans. I've never heard anyone here suggest that we wouldn't have the same sort of deal that Switzerland has or that the Channel Islands have, if you think that Switzerland's too exotic. In other words, free movement of goods and services and capital, but living under our own laws. So I don't see that there would be any impact. To repeat, no one is prejudicing the cross-channel trade. I mean, Norway, Switzerland, all of these countries have complete free trade with the EU. And by the way, I can't help noticing...
He was absolutely clear on that. Nigel Farage, who was at the time the leader of UKIP, was absolutely clear that they were promoting a Norway or Switzerland-style arrangement. They rejected that afterwards. That turned out to be essentially not possible. They made a whole slew of promises, and there was nobody to hold responsible because there wasn't a party there that then could be thrown out of government.
Why would you need to throw a party out of government when you yourself have voted for or against something? You know, you have the vote. The accountability resides in you, the person who's making that decision. Why do you need someone else to blame? In a direct democracy, there are not other people to blame. You make an effort yourself, and you can blame or not blame yourself based on how you voted and what you think is right. I mean, people are free to express their opinion as they want. They're free to express their opinion in the democracy we have today. Just because someone expresses an opinion you think is incorrect or you think is a lie doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself are absolved of accountability for deciding on your own vote. I mean, also, I think this is very one-sided. I mean, the Remain told all kinds of kind of semi-falsehoods as well. I mean, they were going around saying that, they were going around saying that, if we keep this deal going on, then the average household is going to benefit by so and so many pounds. But what you're not telling you is that most of those estimates were made by enormous banks. And when they say an average, they actually mean that some people are going to profit 3 or 4 times to that amount, and some people are going to lose out. So these things are not entirely true either when you start looking into them.
Hold on a second. That was a financial forecast. But a very clear, hard fact claim was that Britain would not leave the single market.
That's not a clear hard fact claim. That's just a preferred strategy. It doesn't. That may well have been their
No. Daniel Hannan, one of the leaders of the Vote Leave campaign, said explicitly that there is no question that Britain would leave the single market, and others said explicitly that there is no question of ending freedom of movement for British citizens.
Okay, so that's their preferred thing, but that's not a clear hard fact at all, and no adult thinks that those are clear, hard facts.
Let me put it to you that many adults did.
Like the speed of light or something like that.
No, but let me put it to you that many adults did believe that.
Okay, so people didn't really want Brexit in your view. So, and the Conservative hasn't been smashing every electoral election since then.
I think that I don't want to argue Brexit with you specifically, so I'm going to go away from that topic. But I just wanted to make the general point that if leaders of a campaign, and I will give you a parallel one in Ireland in the referendum to abolish the Seanad, which failed relatively narrowly, people such as Michael McDowell and actually pretty much everyone campaigning to keep the Seanad framed that as a choice between abolishing and reforming the Seanad. Now, of course, there was no chance of the Seanad being reformed, but they could safely make that claim, knowing that it wasn't being tied to a specific political party who would then suffer from that subsequently. And they would be even better able to make that claim if there were no representative elections.
But why does a party need to suffer? You suffer, or you don't suffer, according to how you voted. So this idea that democracy is about finger pointing at other people is a really odd one. In a democracy, you're a citizen. You have responsibilities. You have duties. You have the ability to act. So you don't need to go and point the finger at someone else. I mean, if you think that what they're doing is wrong, you're free to comment on that.
Uh-huh. And would you not accept that democracy, however, is massively complex, and most people just don't have the attention span to get into that level of detail, and they need somebody to trust?
For sure, and people do listen to experts, but trusting someone isn't the same as giving them control over your life. There's people who I trust, but I don't give them control over my life. I mean, that's taking away your independence.
Do you trust your doctor?
And it definitely has. I don't actually have a GP because, like many people in Ireland, I don't have one.
Well, okay. In the theoretical, then.
Give you an example. My sister's a GP. Do I kind of trust my sister? Yeah. Do I let her make decisions for me? No. I mean, and as a patient, I have the right to make decisions about my own healthcare. Doctors cannot force you to get treatment. For example.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how much you trust them.
No, that's absolutely correct. But, and God forbid, if you were seriously ill, you would be likely to talk to a doctor who said you can do A or B. These are the consequences, the likely consequences in either case, and I would advise you to do A. Would you trust that person?
I don't know. I don't know this person you're talking about, so I really don't know. I kind of make
but in the abstract,
trust someone on an individual basis, you know. But it's kind of not really the point. The point is, I'm not incapacitated, though. I'm in possession of my mental capacities, and I'm able to make decisions about my political preferences. So
I don't want to.
I'm not a child. I'm not a minor.
I don't want to impugn. You're clearly a very intelligent person, but even the most expert people can't be experts in all fields. And if you are perhaps clearly, as you are academic expert, you trust your architect to build your house in a way that it doesn't fall down. You trust your oncologist to tell you how to treat your cancer if you're unfortunate enough to get cancer, and so forth. And trust is required in a whole range of areas that are highly complex. And this is one of them, surely.
Okay, then I think we should have a monarch or a dictator or an enlightened despot in that case, I guess, someone we really trust and who we think is really great to make decisions for us, because there's no difference between getting a house built according to, by the way, to your specifications. You don't normally just give architects a lot of money.
Of course, yes, of course.
They feel like, they are. So the accountability remains with you as the person who's the decision maker in that process, right? So, and this is the same with politics. People are the decision makers in the process in a direct democracy, have the end responsibility. You might delegate a task to somebody, and you might say, do this, and then check if they actually did it. If you came back to a house and your house was being built in a completely different way than you had wanted it to be built, you could take action on that. You would say, this isn't right. I would like it to be corrected. Yes. It's the same with democracy. You don't need to understand how to make a vaccine yourself. You don't need to be able to go into a lab and make a vaccine to be able to look at data and understand that vaccines work, for example.
Would you accept that the vast majority of people who are taking, let's say, the COVID vaccine now, do not look at that, and what they do is they delegate that responsibility? They're entitled to do that, aren't they?
To whom are they delegating this responsibility? Everyone who shows up and lets someone put a shot on their arm isn't delegating any responsibility. They are literally saying yes to this happening to them. So they're not letting the government make a decision on whether or not, this should be mandatory or something. You are making an individual decision. Now, if you feel comfortable, if you say to yourself, well, I'm a person who just believes that it's fine and I don't really care about looking into it, that's fine. You might be a person who wants to look into it more. That's fine. It's up to you. But the accountability does reside with you. And what you're talking about is an argument that comes up a lot with expertise. So people always say this, would you let the average person fly a plane and things like this? No amount of expertise can override what are actually in your interests. And just because someone is an expert, they may not have your interests in mind. So you can have the best, most smartest, most expert person in the world. If they don't really care about you, that's not going to help you very much at all.
Okay.
So politics isn't just about expertise, it's also about interests.
One last question. What happens when an issue affects a large minority?
Okay. I don't know. They seek to become a majority. They seek to convince.
No. That are intrinsically a large minority.
Okay. Give me an example.
Well, for example, we had the repeal of the 8th referendum, and that essentially only affected premenopausal women, who are by definition a minority in the country. And you can imagine a situation, didn't happen, but you can imagine a situation whereby that referendum failed narrowly, broken down on gender lines. The bottom line is that the voters on one side have skin in the game that the voters on the other side don't. How do you handle that situation?
Really? Do men not have children?
I think abortion rights impact on women in a vastly more serious and different way.
Sure, but it doesn't mean that people vote just according just to their immediate.
No, but you're an intelligent person, and you can understand.
Your interest is broader than that. You can hypothetically imagine situations where you might be affected, or you might not be affected, or you might have said, this is in line with my concept of the world. I believe we live in a free and liberal society, so I believe that people should have this right, even if it's not intrinsic to my personal body right at this moment. So,
no, but come on, you're an intelligent person. You can imagine a thought experiment where an issue affects an intrinsically large minority.
And only them and ever them, and it can never affect anyone else.
That's entirely a possible situation.
So one thing I have a problem with about these many thought experiments is that often they are situations that actually don't occur in the world. You know, it's like complete consensus. It's like this never actually occurs, right? Or a completely evenly split vote among the population. I mean, that theoretically could happen, but I don't know of any example of it happening. You know, so if you want to build a political system, you definitely have to build it according to what happens in real life and not according to a thought experiment that could happen but doesn't actually happen, so we don't have to deal with it. You know, I mean, there's enough problems to deal with in the real world based on things that actually happen. In the real world, people are a mixture of interests and views and their view of the world and how the world should be.
Dr. Roslyn Fuller, the director of the Solonian Democracy Institute, thank you very much for talking to me.
Yep, thanks.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Roslyn Fuller at Roslyn Fuller, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, please do go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website, and there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.
I'm always sick. I don't know. I can't do anything. See all of this. What do you expect me to do? Fix it? I'm only 10. I can't even do anything this morning. I just want to be a doctor or anything to help my people, but I can't. I'm just a kid. I don't even know what to do. I get scared, but not really that much. I do anything for my people, but I don't know what to do. I'm just 10. I'm just 10. All of this, when I see it, I literally cry every day, saying to myself, why do we deserve this? What did we do to this? My family said they just hate us. They just don't like us because we are Muslims. Why does Muslims act for you like that? We're just kids. You see all of the kids around me? They're just kids. Why wouldn't you just send a missile to them and kill them? It's not fair. It's not fair.